This past week was a week of mountaintops and valleys for me, maybe like some of you. There were moments I thought it couldn't get any better than this, and moments I thought, where in the world am I? And sometimes when those seasons come, it can feel like there's just a weight bearing down on you. You know, as sheep have that feeling. When you look at this photograph you have up here, that's one burdened sheep, isn't it? There were 88 pounds of wool on that sheep. And I felt like that sheep at times. You know, you can barely walk. You're carrying so much. It's hard to eat. If you fall over, you can't get back up. It's not good to be a sheep without a shepherd, is it? And thankfully, God's word brings us the comfort of knowing we have a shepherd for life. His name is Jesus. And he's not just any shepherd. God reminds us from his word this morning that Jesus is the good shepherd. So as we prepare to hear from God this morning, I want you to take a moment, thank him for giving you a shepherd who is in your life and over your life every moment of your life. God, there is no shepherd like your Son, Jesus Christ, who was willing to die for me. I had no reason to expect it. I certainly couldn't earn it. But by his grace, your love, he provided it. We come this morning, God, not for what we take away, but for what we can give you, our worship, our lives. As we hear your word this morning, God, I pray that we would take it and we would apply it to ourselves. We'd hear your spirit within us, leading us as to how you want to use us in life to bring others to know the salvation that we've found through our faith in your Son, Jesus Christ. So God, this is a time of worship. We're making ourselves available to hear from you, to have you lead us, to have you guide us in your way as our good shepherd. It's in your Son, Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen. So as we left off last week, Jesus told us that he came so that we might have life, and not just any ordinary life. He said having life abundantly. It meant life beyond what you and I could imagine or even ask for, is how Paul put it to the Ephesians. And Jesus told us that he was the door to that life that he came to bring us. Now this morning we're going to go on in this conversation he's in John chapter 10, and he's going to continue, but he's going to change the metaphor that he used last week of calling himself the door, and he's also going to change the focus of his message for us this morning. This morning he's not talking about the life he came to bring us. This morning he's going to come to tell us about the life he came to lay down for us. So join me in following along in the Gospel of John in chapter 10, verses 11 through 15. Jesus continues his conversation. He said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. Sheep need a shepherd. Contrary to the idea that shepherds sit around and cuddle little lambs all day and lay out and stare at the starry skies all night, being a shepherd was an exhausting, trying occupation. It was very difficult. Sheep, by their nature, are wanderers. They just kind of drift off wherever their mind leads them or doesn't lead them. Sheep are completely defenseless. Sheep don't even have enough common sense to know what they should be eating and what they should not be eating. So you can imagine that if a hungry wild animal were to come upon a flock of sheep, they're going to think, buffet. It's funny until we realize he's talking about us. I mean, think about this metaphor he's using of his people being his sheep. We think we have it all together. We think that we can navigate this life in this world in our own power, and we constantly find ourselves failing as we fall, don't we? We're convinced we can get through whatever we have in front of us, whatever mountain comes before us in our own strength and our own power. And it's not until we're completely exhausted, we're completely worn down, that we cry out, "My God, where are you?" Deep down in our hearts, we know we need a shepherd. And certainly God, our Creator, knows we need a shepherd. But Jesus doesn't declare that he is just a shepherd. He declares that he is the shepherd, the one and only shepherd, the good shepherd. And one of the evidences he gives in this particular passage of his goodness is that he points to his willingness to give up his life for his sheep. In contrast to the person who's simply hired to watch the sheep, who he points out are going to turn and run at the first sign of trouble. Now, the hired hand in this passage, it's the people in the world that claim to be there for your benefit, that claim to be there, to provide for your needs, to care for your needs. And in the context of who he was speaking to here, he was probably alluding in somewhat, not small part, to the religious leaders. Throughout the Old Testament, we see God castigating the religious leaders as having failed him as shepherds of his flock, and the consequences that they were going to have for it. So certainly they're in view here when he's talking about these hired hands. You see, the religious leaders of Jesus' day, what he knew about them, and it was very evident to God about them, is they would claim to be there to build the people up, to lead the people back into the kingdom of God, to help them overcome their sin nature, to help them to live in a way that would bring God glory. But really what they were about was filling their pockets. They were about building up their pride. They were about increasing their power that they held over the people. And what God knew is that the first sign of trouble, those religious leaders were going to abandon their people. You and I have people in our lives like that. The world's constantly calling to us, constantly inviting us, constantly trying to entice us that they can satisfy the deepest desires of our heart, the things that stir our souls, the things that we are passionate about, that the world can satisfy for us. In every single instance, the world ultimately lets us down. But the Good Shepherd, talking about God here, owns the sheep. God has a vested interest in our welfare. To the hired hand, all I am is an opportunity to fill someone's pockets. The minute I'm not somehow bringing them more than they're putting into me, they're going to move on from me. And we know we're prone to that in our humanity. When somebody's not meeting our needs, when we feel like we're putting out more than we're getting in, we start thinking, why am I doing this? The world says you shouldn't be. Move on. Whether it's in a marriage, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's in a job, whether it's in whatever it might be. The relationship that Jesus has with us as our shepherd is extraordinarily, unbelievably personal. He's the good shepherd because he knows us, is what he tells us. This word know in the Greek here, there were several words that they knew. This particular word didn't mean that he knew about us. I know a lot about a lot of you, maybe more than I should about some of us. But that's not what it was talking about. It's not knowing something about somebody. It's having an understanding of the depths of how we work, of how we think, of what our heart's desires are. This word know meant an intimate understanding of who we were as a person. And it makes sense that Jesus knows us because he created us. It's not just some passing thing that he says to make us feel good. Oh, I know my people. No, he knows his sheep because he was involved in the creation of his sheep. David understood what Jesus was talking about here when he was writing Psalm 139. He writes this, he said, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways." Did anybody just get a shiver? He's acquainted with all my ways. All my ways. The good ways and the not so good ways. He knows everything there is to know about me. David goes on, he says, "My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." Church, God knows you and he knows me better than we know ourselves. He knows us in the most intimate of ways, in ways that we can't even contemplate. Why should I gain from his reward? When I think about who I am. But God knows that about me. We're not just a number to God. We're not just sheep 4,768,231,720. He knows our natures. He knows that we were created differently. He knows we each have our own paths in life. He knows we each have our own trials in life. We each have our own gifts in life. We each have our own hurts in life. We each have our own blessings and successes and failures and strengths and weaknesses. He knows it all. And he loves us anyway. That's our shepherd. There's nothing that you could show up tomorrow and tell God about yourself he doesn't already know. There's things that you don't even know about yourself that he's going to reveal to you tomorrow. But in addition to knowing us intimately in our nature, our good shepherd also knows our every need. And that's what David was writing about in Psalm 23. That so familiar psalm to us. Listen to how he understands and knows his shepherd. He says, "The Lord is my shepherd." And the first thing he says is, "I shall not want." David wasn't worried about what was coming that day, what might be coming tomorrow. All he knew were two things. The Lord's my shepherd. I don't need to want. He's there. He's there to lift me up. He's there to guard me. He's there to guide me. He's there to protect me. He knows all this stuff. So he knows he has no want at all in life because the Lord is a shepherd. If that's all he knew, that would be all he would need to know. But he elaborates on it in verse 2. And he gives some illustrations of how he knows this. He said, he makes me, think about that, he makes me lie down in green pastures. Now, if you remember a second ago, I told you sheep don't even know what they're not supposed to eat. They'll just eat anything you put in front of them. I have a son that's like that, but he's not a sheep. But because of that, the shepherd needs to be on the guard to make certain that they're in the right pastures. And because sheep are prone to wander, and they don't bother themselves with, is this good for me or not good for me? Sometimes the shepherd makes them have to lie down in the pasture so that they don't just walk through that pasture to the next thing that they see over the horizon. What David knows about a shepherd is that there are times in David's life when he's going to be looking over the horizon to a pasture he'd like to get to and completely miss the pasture he needs to be in is right where he is. And he knows that sometimes God makes us sit down where he has us, even though we want to take God where we want to go. And we don't like it in those seasons in life when God's saying, no, you're staying here. We have our mindset, we have our heart set on something we want to gain or something we want to attain or something that we deem to be important or significant or whatever it is, and we're crushed, we're disappointed, we're heartbroken when we can't get there. And I've had those experiences, you've had those experiences, we know what they feel like. But what's really remarkable is when you look back, you recognize God had you right where you needed to be. And he kept you from going where you wanted to be because it's not where he needed you to be. He goes on, he says, not only does he sometimes make me lie down in the green pasture that I don't even recognize as where I need to be, but he also leads me beside still waters. Now, the idea of leading is important in this particular passage because some animals you drive, like cows. We go on cattle drives. Anybody done a cattle drive? When we went to church out in Montana, that's what they were talking about, were cattle drives. But that's not the word that you use here. In Jesus' day, and even pretty much in today's times, shepherds don't drive their sheep. They lead their sheep. They simply call to them, and the sheep respond to them. And they lead the sheep to where they need to go. Now here he says, it leads into still waters. What was that all about? Well, sheep are tended to be attracted to shiny, glittery things. Running water, rushing water, as the sun's bouncing off of it would get your attention. And as a sheep, you'd go, ooh, that looks shiny, nice thing. That looks interesting. Let's go wander over there. Well, sheep, as you can think about, they have have you ever got a toy animal sheep? They always have their legs real close together. They never stand up. They fall over. It's because sheep's legs are close together and they tend to fall over very easily. And when they get into rushing waters, they're prone to being knocked over by the rushing waters, and when they go down, they don't come back up. But sheep don't know that about themselves. But what David knows about his shepherd is his shepherd knows that about him. That sometimes he can be attracted to the shiny, glittery things in life, not realizing how they can knock them off his feet and put him in a place that he can never recover from. And he knows his shepherd will lead him to the still waters, where his thirst is going to be satisfied in ways he can't comprehend, he needs. And he can do it in safety, and he can do it in security. That's the shepherd David knows. That's the shepherd Jesus is. And he goes on and he says, and he restores my soul. David had more than his share of trials in life. This was probably written in his younger years when he was actually a shepherd at the time, before he was dealing with Saul and the people that were pursuing him and all of the enemies that were surrounding him. But David knew he was going to experience, and probably had even experienced, some deep hurts in life. But what he knew about his shepherd is his shepherd would restore him. He would bring peace to him. He would help to heal him from those hurts that he'd experienced. That there would be restoration brought to him by his shepherd. His shepherd not only led him to still waters, but he knew that his shepherd would lead him on the paths of righteousness. And what he meant here, he knew he was going to be leading him on the right paths, the paths that would lead to the things of God, to the place of God, to the desires of God, which is where David knew he would find all that his soul and heart would ever need. And he could trust his shepherd to keep him on the right paths, because David had the awareness as a sheep, he was prone to just toddle off on the wrong paths. That should give you and I great comfort. We might stray, but because God knows us so intimately, because He loves us so deeply, because He cares for us so greatly, we can trust He's always going to bring us back onto His path if we keep our heart oriented to Him, if we keep our ear attuned to His voice, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then David talks about the inevitable things of life, the valley of the shadow of death, the evil that surrounds us in the world. David had walked through it. David was living in it. You know, we think things today are absolutely horrible, which in so many instances, in so many ways they are, but the reality of life is it was every bit, maybe even more so horrible in the day of Jesus, in the day of David. The types of things that were occurring are unimaginable even to us today. He knew what the valley of the shadow of death was like. He knew what evil was like. But David says his shepherd's rod and staff were his comfort in those times of darkness and evil. The rod was used to gently prod a sheep, to get them to go where they needed to go, to get them to lie down in the pasture they needed to lie down, to bring them onto the path of righteousness. It was also used to ward off the wild animals that would try to devour the sheep. So it was both something to guide them and to something to guard them. The staff was another way to get the more hard of understanding sheep to obey, where you had the crook and they could actually get it by its neck and give it a nice, gentle tug. That was a comfort to David. And the reason is because you and I want the security of boundaries. We want to know somebody is there to tell us when we're about to cross the line of no return. They did a study years ago, and I couldn't remember this morning where I'd read it, but they had a bunch of children, like 3 to 5, 6-year-olds, that they put out into this yard with a big field behind it. And the first time they put them out, there was nothing out there. It was just an open field that went on forever. And all the kids stayed within 10, 15 yards of the house. They wouldn't really go any further. They brought them back the next week, and they put a fence that was about 100 yards away from the house. And an interesting thing happened. The children went 100 yards from the house to the edge of the fence because they were secure. They knew where the boundaries were. Parents, when you guys aren't setting limits for your children, youth, I know you guys don't like hearing it, it's there for a reason. It's there to guard you and to protect you and to train you and to teach you how to navigate the things of life. And when the parents aren't setting those boundaries, we're not being friends to our children. Even though they can't articulate it, it's wired within us to want the security of knowing where the boundaries in life are. That's why it was a comfort to David to know that Jesus was going to tell him and prod him and keep him within those boundaries, and he would protect him within that boundary that he kept them in. He talks about preparing a table before me in the presence of his enemies. David knew that God was going to provide for his every need regardless of what the world was doing around him. He knew that he would have his hunger satisfied. He knew that he would be led by those still waters, have his thirst quenched. He knew that he didn't have to care about the needs he would have in this world, anointing his head with oil. For the sheep, it was the thing that would keep the parasites from them. They would literally anoint sheep's heads with oil. It would keep the parasites, the things of the world that want to suck the life out of you and me. That's what Jesus is there to do, to keep them from us, to keep us from them. He's the good shepherd. He knows your need and my need. And then he says this in verse 6, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Now, I've read this a lot of times, but the word follow caught my attention for some reason, you know. It's goodness and mercy that he's seen in his rearview mirror of life. And I thought, that's so true for me. When I'm going through a trial, when I'm going through a struggle, when I'm not where I'd like to be or where I want to be, and when I don't see how God is moving in my life, it can be exhausting and frustrating and make you angry, and make you anxious and lots of things. And sometimes you wonder, where is God in the midst of this? But as I look back at my life, over 65 years, I can tell you his fingerprints are all over it. And sometimes they're the most noticeable in the most difficult times of life. And I look at what I learned in that. I learned how he strengthened me in that. I learned how he revealed himself and sustaining me in that. And it just makes me go, my God, you're amazing. Goodness and mercy follow me because my good shepherd is with me. And if you wanted to condense all of this psalm that David wrote, you could simply do it this way. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The end. Go home. David knew his shepherd well. And that's because the relationship Jesus has with us as the good shepherd is mutual. He not only says, I know my sheep, but he says, and my sheep know me. Jesus isn't out to hide himself from us. God's not playing hide and seek with us. If you seek God, God's going to reveal himself to you. If you want to know Jesus, Jesus is going to reveal himself to you. We know that Jesus reveals himself through his life, through his words that we have in here, through God's word that he's given us to reveal Jesus as our Lord and Savior. We know Jesus' power and his authority. We know his meekness and his gentleness. We know his servant's heart, how he was able to speak the truth in love, how he had the ability to forgive others who were harming him. We know about his kindness, his compassion for those in the margins of life, his concern for those that the religious leaders in society cast off. We know about how he cared for the sick and lonely, and we know that he had a passion to live for doing the will of his Father and trusting God in all things. We know so much about Jesus Christ, who is God in the flesh, who is our creator of all life. In fact, Jesus says this relationship that he has with us as his sheep and that we have with him as our shepherd is the same as the relationship that he and his Father in heaven have with one another. There can't be a more intimate relationship than Jesus and God, an eternal, enduring relationship. That's the relationship. That's how personal this is for him and his sheep. That's how personal it is for Jesus and you and me. Coming to faith in Jesus isn't just proclaiming that we believe that there's some God in some distant galaxy far, far away. It's believing that he came in the flesh as Jesus Christ to have a relationship with us, that he wants to hear us. He wants us to speak our heart to him, to hear him respond, to know the depth of his love for us, and to desire him above all that we can possibly comprehend. And this love for us is what made Jesus willing to lay down his life for his sheep. Quick show of hands, how many people here would die for a sheep? I'm not going to die for a sheep. Are you kidding me? I'll count them in my sleep. I might guide them or find food for them or whatever else, but think about what they're hearing Jesus say. Shepherds knew one of the things sheep were used for is to be sacrifices for the shepherds. And Jesus is saying, no, the shepherd is here to be the sacrifice for the sheep. For me. But I don't want us to be mistaken in understanding what he's saying. Jesus wasn't saying he was willing to die just to demonstrate that he loved us. He was willing to die because he knew our life depended on his life. He didn't come to be a martyr. A martyr dies, he's not there to defend his sheep anymore. It's just a nice legacy of how much somebody likes somebody. Jesus came to be a savior. That's why he died for us. In Romans 5, the pastor using communion speaks directly to this, and it just really causes me to be amazed every time I read this. In 5:6, it says, "For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly." That's you and me. We're weak and ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, he just keeps heaping it on. Paul says, remember, we were weak, ungodly sinners. He said that's when Christ died for us. And because of that, we have now been justified by his blood. Much more, listen to this, shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. Pastors don't generally like to talk about the wrath of God because everybody leaves going, oh man, that was so heavy. Why do we have to talk about that? That's frightening, but it's true. Take every atrocity that has ever been known to mankind since the beginning of time and put it all together and multiply it infinity over. It doesn't measure the wrath of God. We have no comprehension of what the wrath of God is. But I can tell you this, from the moment we're born, that's what we're headed for. From the moment we're born, we step into this world, we're on a pathway to hell. Eternal separation, eternal punishment, eternal torment, separated forever from our Creator. And that's why Jesus said to the people following him, he said, listen, I didn't come to the world to condemn the world. I came to bring salvation to the world because the world is already condemned. Our shepherd, Jesus Christ, he came to lay down his life to save us from the wrath of God. And he was willing to lay down his life because he knew he had the power to take it back up again and to call us into that new resurrection life through our faith in him. Jesus is our good shepherd because he brings us new life, because he's over all of life. And this is another thing not to mistake because he was very clear here. He said, listen, I didn't have somebody take my life from me. I chose to lay down my life. Judas didn't take my life. The Jews didn't take my life. Caiaphas didn't take my life. Pilate didn't take my life. I chose to give my life as a ransom for all who will come and place their faith in me as their Lord and Savior. And this is why we can come to Jesus, our good shepherd, without worrying who we are, who we've been, where we've been, what we've done, what we've failed to do, what we know, what we don't know about God. None of that matters. The invitation is simply come, and he calls us not because of what we've done for him, but because of who he is to us. Our Savior. Peter reminded his readers, it was by his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Are you hearing this morning God calling to you to come to him, to place your faith in him as your Savior, to turn from your sins? Listen for his voice. Watch this clip of how the shepherd calls his sheep. The sheep know the voice of their shepherd. What is he calling you to right now? Church, as you leave this morning, know that Jesus is with you. He's the shepherd over you. He's calling to you. He's calling you out of your hurt and into his arms. He's calling you out of your trials and into his peace. He's calling you out of the things that you're pursuing in this world and into his kingdom that he's already secured for us, that he's already provided for us. Listen for his voice this week and where he might be calling you. This closing prayer is a benediction from the letter of Hebrews in chapter 13. He closes in this way. He says, "Now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant, equip you with everything good that you may do his will, working in us that which is pleasing in his sight, through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen."